Hey, this is Zacklog the Great, and I am here tonight with my friend Travis.
Hello.
And we are joined tonight by Lieutenant Colonel Tom Kratman. Sorry, go ahead.
Retired. Lieutenant Colonel retired.
Oh, sorry. Wasn't aware of that. That was part of the etiquette.
Yeah.
And in addition to being a retired lieutenant colonel, he is also a, I think prolific would be a good word for it, author of military science fiction. And he has a new book that will be coming out August 4th. Did you want to tell a little bit about that?
It's the final volume of the Carrera verse, the 8th volume, and probably about the 1.7 millionth word or so in the series. It ties up all the loose ends. It's in at least one way, the most science fictional volume in it. And you'll have to read it to find out why, because I'm not going to tell you.
Okay. And so one other note, if you like my work, if you like what I do, and you want to help support me, please consider visiting subscribestar.com/Zacklog-the-great. As usual, links will be in the show description. And tonight we are getting together to talk about G.K. Chesterton's poem, Lepanto. Now, for those of you who have watched some of these before, this is usually the point at which one of us would read the poem. However, this poem is approximately 200 lines long. My own reading of it, which I will also link to. My own reading of it is about 15 minutes long, just poem. So I think we will skip that tonight. Now, I recorded this poem about 3 years ago, something like 3 years ago, and Tom is familiar with it from, well, I don't know, I assume from rather farther back than that. So Travis is the most has just been introduced to it recently. So Travis, how about you? What are your initial impressions here? What do you think of?
Well, I mean, I the first time through, I didn't really know what was going on, and then I watched a couple of the videos you linked, and things started to make a lot more sense. Some of the allusions, some of them didn't, but honestly, the most interesting line to me, which I don't know where it comes from, perhaps you can help me, is Black, Azrael, and Ariel, and Ammon on the wing, giants and the Genii, multiplex of wing and eye, whose strong obedience broke the sky when Solomon was king. You know what that's about, Tom?
I think he's just talking about the supernatural plane, at which, if you remember the part before that, Saint
Right.
Michael clapping his wings of stone. He's talking about the divine aspect of the battle.
Yes, and so as Azrael,
Christians pray the rosary to our saints, to their saints, and their demons and monsters. I mean, there's no way to call it a pro-Islamic poem, you know.
Right.
Yeah, so Azrael, if I have it correct, in Islam would be the something like the angel of death, I think. And so yeah, it's basically that line, and basically the next stanza is that line, and basically the next stanza is Muhammad calling up all these monsters and demons as aid to the battle to come. Which it's actually kind of funny. One thing I was thinking about this when I was, getting ready for this talk, is it actually reminds me a little bit of like a professional wrestling kind of thing, because there's in what's going on in the poem, there's this big long setup, and it's like,
in this
here's
corner we have
right. And there's this big long setup, and it has what's the terms? It would be the heel. In this case, would be a hound, and the underdog face would be Don John of Austria. And there's, like, in terms of the total lines of the poem, the actual battle is a relatively short slice, and I thought that was kind of funny. But yeah, and so for those who aren't familiar with the history, the Battle of Lepanto, a very brief version, the Battle of Lepanto was in 1571, October 7th, and it was a naval battle between the Ottoman Turks and an alliance of Christian kingdoms, and it's quite likely that if the Ottomans had won, if the Turks had won, they would have gone on to significantly more conquest throughout the Mediterranean, and basically rolled up their way through a lot of Italy. And it's kind of difficult to imagine how big a change that would be.
A lot of people try to poo-poo the achievement at Lepanto away. Oh, the Ottomans were back with the Navy within 2 years. Yeah, that's true. But they weren't back with a Navy that had nearly as many Janissary archers, because they were all dead or pulling oars on Christian fleets. So, no, the battle really was important. And it didn't destroy the Turks' ability to build ships, but it seriously impacted their ability to make ships that were effective.
Well, and the other thing is, there's just the psychological effect of it. Whenever one side has not only a decisive victory, but a decisive and very unexpected victory. Like, this wasn't what you would like. You see this going in, and if people were laying down betting odds, the odds would have been pretty well in the favor of the Turks.
Probably. The Turks are unusual. They're one of relatively few people that are capable of being both skirmishers and stand and duke it out infantry. I mean, even today, they're great infantry. Very, very, very fine infantry. So, yeah, the odds were certainly in numbers of ships were on their side. And that's another way that it's popular to poo-poo away Don John's achievement, is by referring back to the galleasses, the 6 very large ships with a lot more cannon than most. That were 4 of them. There were 6. They were slow. They had to be towed out because they couldn't move that well under their own power. In front of the Christian battle line, only 4 of them actually, well, and a later one made it when the battle line fell back, but 4 of them made it out in the front of the left and the Christian center. And as it turns out, yeah, they've got all these cannon, and as near as I can tell, they sank between 2 and 4 Christian ships. I mean, Muslim ships, Turkish ships, and damaged another 10 or 12, which is not what one would call really a huge decisive weapon, About 1% loss, yeah, that's not impressive. What they did do, though, was that they caused the Muslims to lose their order, because they had to break their line up to get in between these ships. Oh, and the galleasses were so high that you couldn't board for beams. So you could take the cannon fire, or you could try to get through very quickly, but you weren't going to board them.
Well, and so let's see. In terms, one thing I found pretty interesting, and this is mentioned briefly in the poem, the unity of symbolism and military strategy here in this battle, because, like, in terms of what the boats were doing, it quite literally was the cross versus the crescent. And I don't know how common that kind of thing was, but I can't imagine like that being a frequent occurrence. The Christian fleet, was arranged in the form of a cross, and the although a symmetrical cross, but and the Muslim fleet was arranged in the form of a crescent, and it is really, like I said, it's just really odd the joining together of the
well, the Muslims were in a crescent because they were trying to outflank us on the left and right. It wasn't to form a crescent; it was just a flanking maneuver, two flanking maneuvers. Neither of which entirely on our left, their right. It was, I believe, the Venetians were in charge on that side, although the various nationalities and ships' contingents were all split up, so nobody could defect, which was a common problem, shall we say, particularly when you had people who didn't like each other very much, Spaniards and Venetians, for example. But that wing was mostly under a Venetian, and he turned their flanking movement into a breakthrough movement and trapped their ships up against the coast. Most of them, some of them got away, most of them couldn't. I mean, the troops. I don't know if any of the ships got away. And I see we've got unlimited minutes now, so I guess we can talk.
Yes, I just saw that too. So that helps definitely. So for again, I usually use Skype for these. For those of you watching, wondering what we're talking about, Tom has had a bad experience with Skype and did not want to use that program for this. So we're doing this on Zoom under slightly different.
Right, it crashes my computer. I don't know why, but it crashes my computer.
But what is it? Yeah, it's and you're talking about the the potential disunity in the Christian fleet, and again, that's also something that is addressed in the poem somewhat indirectly. It's not talking about within the fleet, but he does definitely address there's an entire stanza that's pretty much about the disunity of Christendom in general, because Saint Michael is on his mountain in the sea roads of the north, and that was the chapel Mont Saint Michel. I don't know. I'm probably
pronouncing it. I can't pronounce French for beans either. Don't worry about it.
But the chapel that is regarded as his place, and he put out the call to Christendom to come together for defense, and almost no one answered because. Go ahead.
England was Protestant. The French were allied with the Turks. The Spanish wanted to do something else with that fleet entirely. And then, of course, there were little contingents like Genoa and Venice were not real fond of each other. A lot of people weren't very fond of the Knights Hospitaller, who manned 2 or 3 ships, I think.
I just realized why it is that until I happened across this poem, I didn't really know anything. I was never really taught anything about this battle. And I just realized that's because my education is American, which in large part means, in a lot of ways borrowed from England. And England and Spain were not particularly friends at the time of this. And England would not want to, and so the English probably don't like talking about this a whole lot.
Oddly enough, even the Protestant English and the Protestant Germans celebrated Lepanto. I mean, England and Ireland got raided by Muslim slavers with some regularity, not as badly as Italy did, but it wasn't unknown. And even if they didn't like Catholics very much, they were all still Christian and clearly better than Muslims from a Protestant point of view. No, I mean, Chesterton himself is, of course, English. English Catholic. I don't think that's why. I think it's just that we don't do a very good job anymore. I mean, I first heard this. My high school was Boston Latin, a school at this point in time having, let me think, 385 years of tradition, completely unhampered by progress. It's an unusual school. They had, when I was there, and they probably still have, a declamation requirement. Every marked grading period, you had to recite a speech or poem for your English class. If you wanted to compete to do it in front of the whole school, you could. And I did that for 2 or 3 years, and I got tired of it. But somebody did Lepanto for public declamation at Boston Latin. It was around 1970, I think.
Is that read or recited? Was that read or recited, by the way?
Oh, you memorize the whole thing. Recite. No, you have to memorize it. Did you ever read The Mask of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe?
I have read that. It's been some time.
I did that one.
But yeah.
You know, so that's where I first heard it. I was about 13 or 14.
Yeah, I actually I did a video a while back about the state of history education in the United States, and actually I don't know if you've heard of them. There's a heavy metal band, Sabaton.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Okay, yeah.
I'm not a huge fan, but I like some of their stuff a great deal.
Yeah, and it's just like, you know, I've listened to a few of their songs, then I'm like, okay, so what's this about? And then I go look up stuff, and then at a certain point, I almost always tilt it a little bit. It's not showing up very well. Oh, there it is. Oh, Great War. Yeah, or well, anyway. But yeah, and when I hear one of their songs and I go start looking up this stuff, I'm always like, why has no one told me about any of this? Like, I went through, you know, high school English. I went through, you know, general education, you know, for my bachelor's degree, high school history, you know, and, you know, general education history course for my bachelor's degree. Never heard about so many of these things. And it's like, this is, and it's like, if you want to get young men interested in history, tell them stories about, you know, amazing heroes in, you know, pushing through, you know, horrific battles. And then once you've got their attention, you can fill in the rest around that. And you do that if you,
but you'll be charged with, let me think, what would the charge be? Advancing toxic masculinity. That would probably be the charge.
Well, and also if the heroes are, for instance, Christian Europeans, they'd also check on white supremacy there as well.
And racism. Don't forget racism.
So what was Travis, haven't heard.
I was gonna come back to the poem.
Yeah.
The lines after Michael, you know, when it says the North is all tangled things and texts and aching eyes, and it goes, and Christian killeth Christian in a narrow dusty room, and Christian dreadeth Christ that hath a newer face of doom, and Christian hateth Mary that God kissed in Galilee, but Don John of Austria is riding to the sea. And I'm guessing the hating Mary has to do with the conflicts between Protestant and Catholic.
The Reformation.
Yeah, and so the Protestant Reformation and Europe was, you know, split, and, you know, so Michael sends forth this, you know, call to battle, and almost no one hears because Christendom is divided like that.
It's kind of interesting that the fleet was almost entirely Italian. Even the Spanish ships were manned almost entirely by Italians. Something, we should perhaps remember.
Well, it makes sense. It was their doorstep that was being protected. They're going to have a greater call to rise up.
Although within about 2 years, the stinking Venetians had made another commercial treaty with the Ottomans. 2 or 3 years. So, yeah.
Money talk.
Yeah. Venice was the whore of the seas, really. Beautiful place. The city was a whore.
So it was California.
I think you might be able to draw out some analogies that way. Yeah, maybe.
But what was so again, like Travis said, rolling back to the poem, and so Tom, in these talks we frequently run all over the place and then say, but to get back to the poem, that's quite a common thing.
Yeah, sure.
But he says, and below the ships are prisons where with multitudinous griefs Christian captives sick and sunless, all laboring race repines, like a race in sunken cities, like a nation in the mines. And this was, if I understand correctly, this was the last great battle of oar-powered fleets. And those oars, I definitely on the Muslim side, I
Yes.
don't... Sorry? Oh, okay. Those oars, definitely on the Muslim side, and I'm not as sure about the Christian side, were largely manned by slaves.
Do you want this lecture? Because I can give you this lecture.
Go ahead.
Okay. Contrary to popular myth, on ancient galleys, the rowers were almost entirely free. Occasionally, they used slaves. But A, you couldn't trust slaves. B, you had to beat them to get them to do anything. And C, you couldn't use them to fight. What happened with the, and I'll commend people's attention to Admiral Rogers' Naval Warfare Under Oars. It's a pretty thick tome on the subject. He's not 100% correct, as it turns out, but he's mostly correct. They went from a lot of smaller oars with like 2 guys pulling on top and then 2 below and then 1 below him. That was actually a quinquereme. It wasn't 5 oars. It was 5 rowers on one side of a ship and 1 rowing space. They went to, I think it was called the Zensila system, where you'd have a sort of a captain of the oar, say, port is left, starboard is right. I'm on the starboard side of the ship. Okay. I'm a free man. I've got the oar and it's balanced with a weight on one end, and there's 4 slaves and convicts to my left. Okay. They just provide motive power. I direct the oar. So you can get a lot more use out of a convict with that system than you could out of convict or slave, than you could out of convicts or slaves in ancient warfare. The problem was they wouldn't fight, or you couldn't count on them fighting. Don John made a promise of freedom for all the slaves in the fleet and convicts in the fleet. He didn't have the power to carry that out. The Turk, what was it, Ali Pasha? The Turkish commander also said that he'd free all the slaves if his fleet won. He probably had the power to do that. We'll never know what he really would have done. The Venetians took a different approach. They used almost nothing but free men as rowers, even though they didn't really have to, because the free men could then, once the ships made contact, drop their oars, pick up a sword, spear, or whatever, and a shield, and charge over the side to attack.
And yeah, if I understand correctly, a great deal of naval warfare at the time, like a lot of the actual fighting was done like once the ships made contact, and boarding parties would go one way or the other, or possibly both. And then it was essentially what I guess what you'd say would call marine action, because
An infantry battle at sea. That was almost always true. The occasions when the ram was effective were actually very few. Phormio was Athenians at Naupactus during the Peloponnesian War. It's one of the more famous ones. There were other people who tried to rely on the ram, like the Carthaginians, and the Romans developed the corvus so they could turn the battle into an infantry battle at sea, and the Carthaginians were just slaughtered thereafter. In this case, they talk about ramming. The ships didn't even have rams. They had they call them beaks, I think. And that thing that's sticking up in the front, the idea was to, if you could manage to get a side shot on an enemy ship, you would attack it, and that would cause you to ride up over the hull and break the keel. Don John, by the way, had those all cut off so he could get a little more use out of his cannon.
But so
that would actually get in the way of the cannon fire, then?
Apparently so. On a galley, not a galleass, but a galley, all the cannon were up front. Usually 4 or 6 or sometimes 8. Not particularly impressive cannon either. There might be 2 large ones, 2 mediums, and then 2 smalls. And you loaded them once, fired them once, and that was it. After that, it was an infantry action.
Which actually was, something like, handguns at the time would work as well, which is, why in, who is it? Book by Tim Powers I read, like the character has just, one of the characters has like just 6 or 8 pistols on him, pulls out a pair, fires them, discards them and grabs another, because in the middle of an action, it's, unless you're, if it's a close action, you're not going to have time to do any kind of reloading.
Depends on what you are. That's true if you're cavalry, and cavalry would indeed carry 3 or 4 pairs of pistols. But if you're infantry, this is before bayonets, but you still had pike. The arquebusiers, the musketeers, whatever, would fire, and then they'd retire behind the pike to reload. So the pike would hold them off while they were reloading, then fire again, then they'd fall back like that.
Anyway.
You couldn't do that with cavalry. There were no pikes.
I was going to say, I mean, that held into the old West. That's why the Bowie knife was so popular, because you only had one shot at close quarters. You were more likely to need a knife than a pistol, is what I've read.
Up until Samuel Colt came along.
Well, yeah, until the revolver came along. I mean, this was basically, the 30s, 40s.
What was
You should probably say 1830s, given the historical illiteracy of typically the millennial generation. They don't understand.
So like I was saying earlier, the Ottoman fleet, as you described, a lot of the rowers were slaves or convicts. Many of them Christians they had captured, which then he talks about freeing them, and if you can get enough, if you can get things going right, once you attack a ship, once your men are there, in some cases some of those men were able to break free and join the invading Christians in the fight, which is another disadvantage to using slaves in that kind of context.
Especially enemy slaves. I mean, you might have been able to get away with Muslim slaves, but Christian slaves was maybe a mistake there.
Let's see. I'm trying to think. Sorry, I'm just going through the poem a little bit here, looking for.
So Solomon is mentioned twice. Once in that original, the part that I brought up earlier about the giants and the Jenny, whatever you want to call them. the multiplex of wing and eye, whose strong obedience broke the sky when Solomon was king. Do you know what that reference is to?
No, I don't actually.
Okay.
Okay, well, I'm pretty sure part of it is because I saw this referenced in, what is it, 1001 Arabian Nights. And I believe there's this idea that Solomon was able to, capture and, bind to service a great number of demons. And so part of it was that they had been in service to Solomon, or that he had kind of tamed them, and that's why Muhammad was able to call them up.
Maybe. Although one of the things we don't generally understand particularly well about Islam, we often think of it without even thinking about it as if it's Reformed Christianity. It isn't. It's Reformed Judaism. So they perhaps draw more from Solomon than we do, or than we would think of.
Yeah, because a part of their story is that Abraham and all of these forefathers, they actually were Muslim, and then the story was corrupted. The story was not passed down faithfully, and
Right.
Muhammad was part of correcting that record. And so yes, Solomon also would be they would say he also was part of their tradition, which, I mean, in a way that's not completely different from what Christians did. But what was I do like I do really like the poem, the part of the poem where he's calling up all these creatures and they're reporting to him. It's really one of the most dramatic sections of the poem. They rush in red and purple from the red clouds of the morn, from temples where the yellow gods shut up their eyes in scorn. They rise in green robes roaring from the green hells of the sea, where fallen skies and evil hues and eyeless creatures be. On them the sea valves cluster and the gray sea forests curl, splashed with a splendid sickness, the sickness of the pearl. It's like dramatic, literally colorful pictures, and it's really well crafted poetry. I honestly think it's kind of unfortunate that like people who know of him today think of Chesterton, as an essayist, a novelist. I think his poetry is really, really good, and
This one at least is really, really good.
Have you read more of them, by the way?
What's the one with for the great gales of Ireland are the men that God made mad, for all their wars are happy and all their songs are sad. Ballad of the White Horse, was it?
I haven't read that one yet. I need to, but I haven't gotten that one yet. I've read one full collection of his, and there are a couple of other collections, and then there's the Ballad of the White Horse, which is a short book length poem, and I haven't read that one. But yeah, he's got quite a few that are definitely worth paying attention to. Actually, and Travis has helped me cover a couple of others of those. Let's see, Love's Trappist. Which other ones, Travis? Do you remember?
I don't remember.
Okay.
I forget things as fast as I read them, unfortunately.
See, that's why I memorize them. Then it sticks.
Well, there you go.
But it is one thing, and it's kind of inevitable given the way he sets up this poem, because he wants to do it as a dramatic encounter, and you have to have a hero, you have to have a villain, you have to have these, and you don't have a lot of time. It's not even at 200 lines. That's not a lot of writing space, and you have to have these clearly drawn characters, and so in this, the hero is Don John of Austria. Which is a somewhat confusing name because Don John would be Spanish, of Austria. It's like a Spanish lord, a Spanish knight of Austria. That's a little bit odd there.
Do you know about Don? Do you know what Don John? What he was?
I know he was a bastard son of the Holy Roman Emperor,
Charles V and Barbara Blomberg.
Right, and so as a bastard son, he belonged to both and neither at the same time, which is
he was raised and he was taken away from his mother. She didn't see him again until he was in his 20s, I think, shortly after he was born. And he was raised in Spain, and he was particularly in his teenage years a very naughty boy indeed. Particularly where women and girls were concerned. He spent a lot of time in confession, I'll put it that way. But he didn't know who he was until he was finally introduced to the King Philip II, I think it was, of Spain, who told him, "Do you know who you are?" "Well, I know my name." "Well, I'm the King of Spain, and I'm your brother." And Philip took fairly good care of him, but he always made it very clear that he was a step down from properly born, fully noble birth.
What's the who's the character in King Lear? I don't remember. Is it Ed? Sorry, I was just thinking about there's a character in King Lear who a significant part of his motivation for his turn to villainy is that he is a bastard and therefore denied the full rights of what would an otherwise noble birth.
I haven't read King Lear in 50 years, so I can't tell you.
Okay, but you have you have Don John of Austria as the hero, but you also have like you said, you have the Spanish fleet or the Spanish ships, and you have largely Venetian sailors, and so this is not something that Chesterton really covered as well as he covered very well, understandably because of time constraints, but it's the group effort in these people coming together, and like you said in your essay, what's it called, Where Were Secular Humanists at Lepanto? Not really people who in many other cases had a good reason to get along, not people who were generally friends.
No, they hated each other.
Yeah, let's put it simply.
and it's and so uniting being able to unite these people in this common cause, even if only for this one moment, is a pretty remarkable thing in itself.
Yeah, I mean, Don John's admiralship was, he was a young man. He didn't really know much of anything. He didn't really know anything about naval warfare, though he had an advisor or two. But fairly plainly, his leadership was of a very high order. The personal magnetism and charisma that gets people to do what you want them to do, except for the commander of the Venetians, who was problematic all through. Veniero.
Well, and and the other thing, one other thing in this one in the poem. Actually, now that I think about that, he doesn't actually say this. One miracle regarding this, the Pope, when this battle was taking place, he was in a meeting, hundreds of miles away, before any kind of high-speed communication. And when the battle was won, he stood up and said, "Gentlemen, we must stop for a moment and give thanks to God, for a great victory has been won."
People after the event, trying to compare notes, said that it was at the moment that Ali Pasha's banner fell. The Turkish commanders and their flagship's banner fell. That the Pope stood up and said, something like, "Our fleet is victorious," or "We must go give thanks to God. Our fleet is victorious." First, he went and looked out a window for a couple of minutes first, looking up at the sky. Then he turned around and said, "Meeting's adjourned and let's go to the chapel."
Yeah, and so what was
Go ahead and explain that one away.
Well, oh crud, I lost it. I had something.
So what do you think about that, Sean? I wanted to go back to the Allies who hated each other and ask Tom. I mean, I don't know, my history's not that great, but I imagine it's probably a fairly common thing that allies are not very fond of each other, but they're kind of thrown into a situation where it's in their interest to get along.
Certainly we and the Brits didn't like each other all that much during World War II. And they still don't like us. Yeah, it's not particularly uncommon. I mean, no ally, except for the United States, somewhat surprisingly, ever puts its allies' interests ahead of its own.
Right.
Okay, so I think, so what was Let's go on again. Oh, I feel silly.
Early onset senility, is it?
Yes, I'll be running for president in 2024 with Joe Biden. But Pope was in his chapel before day of battle broke. But
yeah, there's a record of that in the Vatican records.
Oh, that was it. And actually, and again, this is referring to your essay that was an afterword to one of your novels. One thing about this battle and the Crusades and a lot of other many other cases in history, it was a religious war, and the Muslim. I mean, it was Muslims versus Christians, and also at another level, it was Turks. It was just Turks versus Venetians. It was just we want to capture this land, but you really can't discount the effectiveness of their religious faith in this making bringing the people together and motivating the soldiers to fight, and I think that's something that a lot of Americans don't really pay attention to, and and our military in a lot of ways, because we have, in terms of equipment, in terms of organization, we have an enormous amount of power, but in a lot of ways it kind of seems like we don't know why the past 20 years we don't know why we're really doing these things. We don't have a purpose, we don't have a definite goal, and on the other side of the recent wars, they definitely know why. They know why they're fighting. They're fighting for their home, and they're fighting for their faith. And
Well, you know why they're really fighting? It has to do with two things. It has to do with the corruption of the various oil states, the rulers of the various oil states. And it has to do with the position of women in society. And we're a target because, from their point of view, they're under continuous, virulent, 24/7, 365 cultural attack by us, even though we intend no attack until we did attack, of course. But just imagine a people whose view of us is driven by watching reruns of Dallas.
yeah, and well, and it's actually this was addressed, I remember, in, oddly enough, a book by Neil Stephenson that is theoretically about operating systems. And he mentions and he tends to wander all over the place, and he said, like, at one point, they see, this culture that is like, just blasting out all over the world, and they see it as amazingly hostile to theirs, even if it's not a direct attack, just, very different view of the world, very different values. And honestly, the people running, movie studios and TV today, I actually kind of sympathize with their problems with that.
It wouldn't even be all bad if they all had their heads chopped off now.
Oh, God. Well, within my lifetime, we might find out how that goes.
Very likely.
But like I was saying, if one side has, one side can have a tremendous technological advantage, and even perhaps numerical advantage, but if they don't know why, if they don't have a clear reason why they're fighting, it's not bad odds that they're going to lose. If the other side has a purpose, has a reason they're fighting. And having a unified culture, having a sense of who we are, what it is we want, and what it is we want to do to put forward in the world, that's something that America doesn't have a lot of these days. And I think that's why we haven't been as successful in a lot of ways, despite all this power that we can throw around.
But the big mistake is when the Frankfurt School got off the boat in New York, we should have shot them right on the pier. Had we done that, we'd be in a lot better shape now.
Who's the Frankfurt School? I'm not familiar.
Oh, go ahead.
They're a group of German Marxists, basically, who looked at World War I wasn't supposed to happen. Okay, the workers of the world were supposed to throw off their chains, not contribute to collaborate in killing each other. And of course, they did, overwhelmingly flock to the colors and defend their countries rather than their class. They set up a school in Frankfurt to more of a think tank, really, to inquire into why this had happened. They had to leave when the Nazis arose, and they went first mostly to Switzerland, I think, and then they came here. And if you want to know where cultural Marxism comes from, and really the long march to the institutions comes from, it comes from them.
Yeah, they left Germany in, I guess it would be in the mid 1930s, because they were they were two categories that the Germans that the Nazi Party wasn't particularly friendly to. They were Marxists, and most, if not all of them, were Jewish.
Largely Jewish.
And they came here, and what we think of, what we call progressivism today, that ideology is in America. In America, that ideology largely comes from them and their work. And oh God, yeah, that's.
Maybe we should get back to the poem. It's depressing.
I was thinking the same thing.
So, one kind of interesting thing, and the poem, the last miniature stanza there is about Cervantes. Miguel de Cervantes, who author of Don Quixote, extremely long and rambling novel, which I have read in translation because I don't speak I don't speak early modern Spanish that well, but the last small stanza there is about Don Quixote, which is kind of an odd. I
thought so too.
It's an odd finish to it, and at the same time, it very much fits it because part of the idea of this is the Christian romantic, crusade, the Christian romantic tradition of knighthood and crusading.
Okay.
Even
can we? Do you recall him talking about Don John being the last knight of Europe, to whom the bird is sung, that once went singing southward when all the world was young?
Yes.
Okay, who's the last knight of Europe besides Don John?
Yes, Don Quixote, who was also mostly pretty much crazy.
A bit, and Don John dancing in the prow of his ship to basically inspire the troops as they're closing to battle. That may be a little on the odd side too.
Well, and the other thing, Don Quixote was kind of crazy. He was also courageous and honorable, and doggedly persistent in his craziness. That he would fight for these things he believed in, even though most of the things he was fighting were figments of his imagination.
Illusions and delusions, sure.
He had passion.
I don't think he's an exact literary translation of Don John, but I think there's an inspiration for him in Don John, yes.
Well, and the other thing, and this is regrettably something I don't think we see as much today, Cervantes was fighting in this battle. Cervantes was a soldier. In fact, lost the use of one of his hands.
Left hand.
Fortunately, because then he was still able to write during this battle. And then he went on to write this great work of English literature, and the intellectuals and the soldiers. I'm sorry,
great work.
I say English. I said English. Great work of literature.
That'll work.
But went on to write this great work, and it seems like the intellectual, and the literary, and the strong fighting man in the military have been rather divorced in our society today, which is probably not an entirely healthy thing. And well, what's Brian Nehemiah? Well, and part of it, and I referred to this when I was talking about Robert E. Howard's poem To Moderns, and part of it is is that publishing today is largely controlled by, to use Brian Nehemiah's phrase, the dead egg brigade. That is women who went into these big professional careers, never had kids, probably now, even if they would fiercely deny it, rather regret that choice, and are rather bitter about the whole thing, and they're kind of running a lot of the literary enterprise today, which is not the healthiest way of organizing things, probably.
No, fortunately, Bane doesn't fall into that category. So, although Bane is run by a woman, she has a kid.
So, back to the Cervantes. I like the line, "A straggling road in Spain, up which a lean and foolish knight forever rides in vain." And it makes me think of, I'm going to probably say the wrong name now. Is it Sisyphus that rolls the rock up the hill?
Yeah, you've got him.
Yeah.
Yeah, Sisyphus.
It very much has the same feel to it.
Well,
and then his
go ahead.
And then his smile, because he did speak of the Sultan's smile, this sort of evil smile, and he says it's not that smile, and he settles back the blade. It's like, yeah, I think going back to what you said, this passion, this purpose, and he's putting the blade back for now, and smiling about the next time.
Well, and there's two things with that. One is, as a literary device, it's also kind of a bookend, because it starts out, the very second line, the Sultan of Byzantium is smiling as they run. And so he's pulling it back to the start. And the other thing, and he settles back the blade, and, part of the character of the Sultan was, you're not going to put the blade away. Like, as long as when you have an opportunity, you are going to go on conquering. And, part of the character, at least as, Chesterton writes it, in this, is that it's a time for peace and a time for war. And, the time for war had closed here, and it's time to put that away and go to other things.
There was Europe used to delude itself that the Ottomans, every time there was a new emperor or new sultan, they'd say, oh, well, maybe this one will turn out not to be so warlike as the last one. Just couldn't quite bring themselves to understand it. The person didn't matter, except in terms of more competent and less competent. The Ottomans had to conquer. They had to expand. It was just a cultural mandate. So there was always going to be war, and they were just deluding themselves into thinking that there could ever be a permanent peace among them. The Venetians had a good deal of very pleasant communications, commerce between themselves and the Ottomans. And the Ottomans took Cyprus away from them. They were foolish to think the Ottomans ever would not try to take Cyprus away from them. It was always living on borrowed time. Europe kind of living on borrowed time now, actually.
For, in some ways, some of the same reasons. Oh, we can make peace with these people. We can live together amicably. Well, and that's also part of the reason why we have another poem I had recorded. I think Travis was there for that one. Was Wordsworth's poem commemorating the siege of Vienna, the raising of the siege of Vienna by John Sobieski. And it's just 100 years later, and there's another of these battles between Christendom and Islam, where you have this one point that's holding the line for Christian Europe. And again, if Vienna had fell, could have been a very real problem for a lot of Europe at that point. Let's see. Let me find.
I thought the reference, to 400 years ago, I don't know what the word kismet means, but, then it goes Richard and Raymond and Godfrey. I mean, referring back to, I'm assuming, the original Crusades.
Yeah.
So kismet would be, fate or destiny, what is going to happen. And, so part of that idea is Christians believe in free will. Christians believe that, people genuinely can make choices and genuinely can, well, unless they're Calvinists, which is a different thing, and we're not going to go there right now. But people genuinely can make choices and genuinely can change what happens. And so Christians don't believe in fate, and Christians, where is it? It is he that says not kismet. It is he that knows not fate. It is he whose loss is laughter when he counts the wager worth. And the idea that if you die in a good cause, or even if you die fighting for a good cause, or if you die because you refuse to renounce your faith, that's nothing to be sad about. Even if you don't win in the moment, that is part of the roots of Christianity, that in the long view, my death at this moment isn't the worst thing that can happen. And it's also something we need to get back a little bit.
Or a lot.
Okay, so usually when I'm doing these at about this point, I'll say I think I've covered all the things I wanted to say. In some ways, it's a very positive thing about the poem, and in some ways it's unfortunate for our talk, because I don't think, unless we went for several hours, I don't think I could really cover all there is to talk about this poem, and particularly not the actual history surrounding it.
Yeah, especially not if I'm piping in with lectures regularly. So
I like the lectures, though.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you.
And so
it is one thing though we should cover. Go to the line that says, "He holds a crystal phial that has colors like the moon." You know what that's about?
I actually was just listening to someone talking about this today, because I had, when I was working on this initially, because I memorized this also. When I was working on this initially, I had taken that to be about suicide.
No.
That doesn't appear, but someone said that King Philip was, that at least in terms of the story that Chesterton was telling, that King Philip was considering poisoning Don John once he came back.
Right. There were persistent rumors to this day that he did poison Don John. There's no evidence to speak of, except that it was perhaps in his advantage to have poisoned him. But if you look at how Don John died, it shrieks poison. A not very good, very old, not terribly deadly, but eventually deadly poison. Doesn't mean that that's what did it, but the rumors were always there.
Well, and, as much as you don't like it, you also definitely see why he might want to. The motivation is pretty clear. You have this charismatic leader returning from a great military victory. Hey, that looks like political competition. I should probably get him out of the way before he causes me problems.
So the line that I noted right before it was, the walls are hung with velvet that is black and soft as sin, and little dwarfs creep out of it, and little dwarfs creep in. I'm assuming the dwarfs are sort of a representation of, the demons in the closet.
I think it's just small-minded bureaucrats, but, it could go either way.
I think, I remember reading somewhere when I was working on this the first time, was that it also looks like it was a reference to, and I can't remember the name, some painters, like some painter of the time and like these figures that were in the background of a lot of his paintings, and little corrupt, nasty little dwarves. But I can't put a name to that right now. So, okay, so like I said, this is usually the point at which I'd say, well, I've said everything I want to say. Not going to say that for several hours, but I will say, Travis, are there any last points you wanted to cover? Are there any points that really jumped out at you that we didn't get to?
I think that's it, except I don't think I covered the second part of the Solomon. So we talked about the first part, but then we have set the seal of Solomon on all things under sun, with knowledge and of sorrow and endurance of things done. I didn't know whether that seal of Solomon, if you had any idea what that referred to.
Probably just the law.
Okay. His law.
Well, and so imposing the Sharia law, imposing Muslim rule on everything that they were on everything that they were able to conquer. Well, and the other one other thing for me, it's just a fantastic turn near the end there. He's talking about the Christian prisoners. And many a one grows witless in his quiet room in hell, where a yellow face looks inward through the lattice of his cell. And he finds his God forgotten, and he seeks no more sign. But Don John of Austria has burst the battle line. And this moment where, he's given up. He's in hell. He's not going to be rescued. It's done. My God, why have you forsaken me? And at that very moment, that's when Don John breaks their lines. The fleet conquers and liberates the prisoners, and that is another fantastic moment of this poem. Tom, how about you? Were there any other parts of the poem or any other parts? Any other of the history that you wanted to?
I'm particularly fond of the part that comes right after where you let off. Don John pounding from the slaughter painted poop, the back of the rear deck of a ship covered with blood, purpling all the ocean like a bloody pirate sloop, scarlet running over on the silvers and the golds, breaking of the hatches up and bursting of the holes.
Well, and I've
thronging of that labor under sea, white for bliss and blind for sun and stunned for liberty. I'm going to do a book recommendation.
Empires of the
Sea by Roger Crowley. It is, I've got a couple of books by him. He's a wonderful, wonderful historian and writer. And I'll recommend that to you and to anybody.
It was Empires of the Sea.
Right.
Well, and one other thing I will say about that, because when I was working on memorizing this, one of the things I would do sometimes, if I was driving or if I was working on something around the house, I'd listen to other people's versions of this, and I'm rather disappointed how dry and dispassionate a lot of the readings I've heard of this poem are, and it's and so because you can definitely put a lot into that stanza there. Although I will say, one thing I discovered for myself relatively early in doing these is that when you're recording, especially if it's just voice, if you want to sound engaged and interested at all, you have to yourself sound like a maniac. Like you really have to go hard at it to sound involved. And so I understand why most of the readings are a bit flat. But Well, like I said, there's a lot more to talk about with this poem and with the events. And regrettably, I don't think we have the time to go to that tonight. But I think for people who like the poem and for people who want to learn a little bit about the history, I think we had a good talk tonight. Thank you for joining us tonight, Tom. Thank you, Travis. And
Glad to be here.
And God be with you.